Bio Interviews podcast. Today we have for the first time not one but two guests in a discussion split into three parts. Helen Rogers, Chair of the Institute of Physics Environmental Physics Group and consultant in education and atmospheric science, is joined by returning guest Luthais McCash, Chair of the Mathematical and Theoretical Physics Group at the Institute of Physics and Chief Scientific Officer at Sigma Solutions. Loads more information about each of the guests can be found in the description, as their accolades are too numerous to fit into a brief introduction. In part one of this series, we discuss interdisciplinary science. In the second, environmental physics, and in the last part of this series, we discuss some of the big questions of physics education. Enjoy. Hi both, thanks for joining me. To start off the discussion today, I'd like to ask, has there been a particular intersection between physics and any other discipline that you found the most exciting, and what's made it the most exciting? For both of you to answer and then lead into a discussion about that.
Hi, so I think really you've hit upon quite an interesting topic here, which is the role of interdisciplinarity within science and the cross-cutting nature of science as we now know it. I think we've gone through a phase of the Renaissance man, the polymath, through to quite a siloed set of subjects within science. And we seem to be coming out of that now, I think, for the good, into much more of a cross-disciplinary approach. If you only look back actually to the likes of Marie Curie, everyone's shocked that she got a Nobel Prize in two subjects, in chemistry and in physics. But in actual fact, I think the interesting branches of science happen on those boundaries and in those gaps. And so actually, physics, chemistry, biology, maths, their integration is, I think, what excites me, and I think is where the future discoveries are likely to be made. Personally, I've worked at the interface of physics and chemistry and maths for many years within an environmental science perspective, or an atmospheric physics perspective, as that's what I really am. And that, of course, brings together so many different subjects, which I think is, as I say, where the future of science really lies and where the exciting stuff is.
Where do you think, so we'll get onto Luthais in a sec, but we're going to get onto environmental physics in part two, but aside from that, is there like one other place where you find the most interesting before we speak in a deeper way about environmental physics?
I think in terms of where do I find it most interesting, I think I probably have to say within something like biophysics.
Okay.
And so much of the drug discovery aspects of research that happens nowadays, and you only have to look to the COVID vaccination program and the development of a vaccine itself to realize the interplay between these subjects and the importance of understanding and appreciating both. And so I guess biophysics would be my second choice. That I have no wish to change subject matter personally.
Of course, yeah, no regrets.
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree on the biophysics point of view as well, actually. So I started off in mathematical biology actually before going into mathematical physics, and so kind of historically there's always been an affinity to the maybe standard life science side of things, but even recently, in conversation with collaborators, we were talking about colloidal crystals and these kind of crystalline structures and how we can model them. And there was some experimental results by some colleagues of mine in Norwich that showed that you can find regular patterns in kind of certain crystals, in mechanisms that we wouldn't have expected such patterns to appear in. And my colleagues and I had this discussion, and we were thinking about different applications. And so if you look at gallium scans in hospitals, so what they do is that they use gallium as a radioactive isotope, and they inject it into a vein, and they scan you, and where you have areas of infection, for example, the gallium is attracted to these areas of infection, and it lights up. Now, it's not the case that people are being injected with radioactive isotopes on such a frequent basis that the risks outweigh the benefits, of course, but looking at these colloidal crystals, you can imagine on a nanoscale, by understanding how they behave and how their structure appears, that you can engineer such structures in terms of biomarkers, or being able to trace, for example, tumor growth, etc., etc. So I definitely think there's a huge role, an interface between biology and physics, and I think that is exciting. And again, not to come too much into what we might come on to later, but in terms of public understanding of science, I think that biology is a field that people can relate to a little bit more, because it's in some ways about them. You know, you have that, well, I'm a biological organism, and so there's some relation there. But I think that, you know, I mean, everything really, in many ways, can be underpinned by some fundamental physical principle. And we use a language to describe those physical principles often, and that language largely is mathematics. And we can, but that in its own right, it can be inhibitive when it's not then applied to these other fields. So I definitely am on the same line of thought with Helen in terms of the diversity across different scientific practices.
And do you think, I know you said, Helen, that you think this is becoming more the case, and that science is becoming more interdisciplinary, and we're kind of entering into this new era. Is it more and more useful for researchers and people going into science to have more of an interdisciplinary knowledge, or is that something that can just be, is that something where you can apply one set of skills to a wide range of things, and you don't necessarily need as much going into it? If that's the right way of phrasing the question.
Again, actually, a really interesting question. So I think you need to have an inquisitive mind to do research. You need to have a skill set, be that competency in a mathematical language, but you need to have an ability to adapt and think almost in a parallel way. So often, actually, what we do in one field is applicable to another, but we don't necessarily realize it. And sometimes we don't actually speak the same language across those fields. And it's about communication and about translation. But I think you have to have an appreciation of the world around, and you have to have basically your eyes open. So many people go into science, I think, with quite a tunnel vision as to maybe what they want to study, maybe what they want to research. And actually, they don't necessarily realize what's beyond that. And if I even just think about my own path, certainly when I started down the route of being interested in physics, I didn't know that my future job existed. And I don't think my future job actually did exist when I set out on that path. Part of it you make yourself through discovery, through opportunities to do research. And part of it is about being sort of open-minded, as you said. So do you need to learn interdisciplinarity? I think you need to be able to learn to apply skills from different fields to different areas, be that an understanding of languages, geography, humanities, you need to be able to apply those and learn from them into other fields. And it comes back to this whole idea of the polymath to some extent. Being able to see patterns in words is no different than being able to see patterns in statistics. It's about having an open mind to these things. And so that's where I would encourage people, is to think, how can I apply this to other fields? I remember sitting at dinner once with someone who looked at the transfer of disease, speed at which diseases are transferred. And my particular area of interest is around the impact of aviation on the environment, so anthropogenic impact. And it suddenly dawned on us, sort of, we were talking and we were discussing, actually, you know, often when you, and this is pre-COVID, often when you have an epidemic or if you had some sort of biochemical release, at what point should you shut an airport? Is it too late? Has that disease been transferred around the world? Of course, it's quite pertinent now to some extent, but as I say, this was pre that. And so we actually were sitting literally just around a dinner table, and it was like, well, hang on, I can tell you how fast things go from one place to another around the world. I can tell you that. And my colleague, who was interested in incubation period for diseases, could fill in effect, the chemistry rate. And so between us, suddenly it was a case of, well, actually, we've got the skills between us to do this, but you have to have the open-mindedness, you have to have your eyes open to the possibility of adapting what you do to another cause. And that's where I get very excited, actually. It's like, oh, we could do this, you know, we between us. And of course, it relies on collaboration, which is so important. And I think often, again, overlooked. I think, you know, actually, to be skillful in sciences, you have to be a good communicator and a good collaborator to really benefit from that interdisciplinarity. But for me, that's it's at those interfaces, as I say, that I think the biggest impact of physics is probably likely to take place in the future as well, be it in the development of better battery storage or future technologies. I think it's there that the really exciting things happen. After all, if you do nuclear fusion, as they've just sort of announced, you know, that's marvelous. But it's only marvelous if you use it in the right way and you adapt it. And for that, you need a much bigger community.
That's interesting. I like the point about coming at it as more of a polymath. I thought that's something we can maybe speak about later in the education bit more. There's maybe something about here in the UK, we only really do 3 subjects at A-level, or we can maybe speak about the benefits of having a wider education versus a narrower one later. Lewis, do you have any thoughts on that same issue?
Yeah, again, I have to agree with Helen. I mean, I think that you know, when you maybe study at high school and then you go to select a subject at university, I think being young and naive in some ways, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but being naive, you kind of have this unawareness of the interdisciplinary nature of science. And so why did I get into science? I got into science because I was curious. I didn't really get into science thinking I was going to become a physicist or I was going to become a mathematician. I came to science because I asked myself, well, actually, why is it that water freezes at 0 and boils at 100, for example? And in terms of that interdisciplinary aspect of things between fields, even things in a related field might not always seem related. So if you look at, and I'm conscious that I'm straying into an area that is not my expertise, but I'm sure I'll be corrected in a moment if I say something naff. But if you look at, for example, windstorms on Jupiter, at the most basic fundamental level, you can describe these by some sort of derivation of the Navier-Stokes equations, which are very prominent equations used to describe fluid flow. And yet you can go to NASA's headquarters in the States, and you can watch them pour cold cream into hot coffee and model that process with exactly the same types of equations. And so what you're trying to kind of model in that sense is a range of different parameters, not least, pressure changes, viscosity between the hot cream and the cold coffee, the cold cream and the hot coffee, I should say. And then you have obviously the atmospheric changes in pressure and temperature within Jupiter's atmosphere. But if you say to somebody, for example, maybe, as the term is used, a layperson on the street, they might not necessarily connect these, but actually they can be quite well connected, and having this small, what we often describe in physics as a toy model, having a smaller kind of model that we can use to give us some intuition about the behavior of these dynamics can be really useful in terms of being able to foresee what the larger scale dynamics of a system might be. But I absolutely agree with Helen that, collaboration is a key thing. Being able to speak to people, whether they're other physicists, whether they're other chemists, whether they're engineers, whether they're mathematicians, whether they're biologists, I think that it's really useful in terms of just having a different opinion. And that different opinion could come from the fact that their training is slightly different in terms of their background. Or that could be a different opinion from someone that has the same training, but just a different experience on how to approach a problem. So I definitely think the collaboration and communication aspect is highly useful as well.
So I'm chuckling there because you mentioned about the coffee and the cream. So
what have I said that's wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. So in the Department of Applied Maths and Theoretical Physics at Cambridge, where I have to be located for many years, we used to have clear glass mugs for that very purpose, so that we could actually look and watch eddy diffusion, mixing, stirring, and so forth. And in terms of simple models, we used to, sounds a bit as a bit bizarre, I know, but we used to have what was called a rotating bucket experiment, where literally you would spin a bucket from a long piece of rope, and you would look at the vortex that forms and eddy diffusion that happens at the edges of that, as described by those Navier-Stokes equations. And that was within a planetary physics perspective. So it just goes to show those simple experiments, but also that application to different environments is really important.
And even if you think about the bucket experiment that you've described, so I spent some time collaborating with OCIAM, which is the kind of Oxford Centre for Industrial and Applied Mathematics, and a colleague of mine there we supervised a student together, and their project was actually about mathematical modelling of food blenders. And so if you imagine a food blender that has some liquid in it, and you rotate the blades, you need to then work out, for example, what the optimal rotational speed is, as an example of one thing, in order to ensure that all the food gets mixed within this fluid, what's effectively a fluid with interdispersed particles. Yeah, so the food in the fluid gets mixed, the smoothie gets mixed, but also it gets mixed in such a way that if the rotational speed of the blade there isn't correct, what do you get? Well, you don't get the full mixing, but if it's too much, you actually get some sort of parabolic nature that is confined by a lid. So you need to then think about the boundary layer of that system, amidst other things. But again, what you're really modeling, if you think about a smoothie, is you're modeling a fluid flow problem that can be described by the Navier-Stokes equations in some sort of cylindrical coordinate way, because it's sensible to do it in that way. And you say, well, that's maybe interesting for food blenders, but how is that important? Well, again, not to foreshadow into the environmental physics section, but that's important because you can then start doing calculations on power reduction and the energy requirement in order to actually optimize blending. And then you take that into a commercial regime, and you have the commercial influence about how these companies can manufacture more efficient food blenders. One of the big ones was with the likes of Beko, who are a white goods supplier, and with washing machines. And it's the same, it's the spinning of the drum in the washing machine. How do we do that in such a way that allows us to wash our garments effectively, but at an energy efficient regime? And so we've gone from, windstorms on Jupiter to cold cream into hot coffee to having power-saving electrical appliances. And fundamentally, a lot of the, if you like, the base equations are the same or similar, but it's having that interdisciplinary nature and having those interdisciplinary conversations with other people that enables, I think, scientists to be able to take that progressive step forward to say, well, we have three systems that are all modeled fundamentally the same, with some, of course, deviation in other terms, etc. But fundamentally start from the same premise. How can we actually how can we use this same premise in three different ways that gives us value, and gives us value not just in science, but I think as a society overall, which is important as well.
That's interesting. That is crazy to think that areas which are so completely different can sort of be problem solved in the.
Can I actually carry on from what you were saying?
Yeah. Sorry,
Casper. So actually, I disagree with what you just said, Casper. Sorry, because you said these are fundamentally different things. The wind on Jupiter, the coffee, the blend mix, and that's I think what we're trying to sort of say is that actually
they're not fundamentally different.
Different. It is the same. It's the same processes. They're just applied in a different context, and that's the important thing. I think that we need to communicate to potential physicists, to other scientists, is that we're not different beings speaking a different language, even internally within the physics community. Actually, this is all problem solving. This is all curiosity, which is the same reason I got into it as well, actually. And they are actually all fundamentally built from the same building blocks.
I should probably just caveat that a little bit to say that even though they're fundamentally all the same thing, that shouldn't be an implication that good science is easy. So just because we have some sense as to the fact that, yes, okay, fundamentally we can describe different processes by similar equations, that's not necessarily to say that the way in which you describe these in an effective way is a simple process. Another example is something like the nonlinear Schrödinger equation. I've used this previously to model Bose-Einstein condensates, so supercooled atomic systems. And I have a colleague that's a postdoc at UEA, and he uses this to describe water waves against cliffs and things like this. So again, you kind of say to yourself, well, water waves against cliffs and ultra cold atomic systems with kind of superfluidity properties don't appear on the face of it related, but actually can be described similarly in terms of the mathematics.
In terms of, I know you mentioned that people in different disciplines can often speak a completely different language. Other than just speaking to people in different disciplines, do you think there's anything else that can be done to make it easier to spot those sorts of areas where problems are fundamentally the same?
I think it comes back to having eyes open and communicating.
Okay. If
you sit behind a computer all day and work in an isolated bubble, you will never see what's happening, hear what's happening, or have those conversations. And I think it's about having an open mind, keeping your eyes open, and engaging with people.
Right.
That's the best way to do it. And keep learning. We all are. I'm fascinated at the moment. I'm reading a book about the periodic table and all the elements in it. This is somebody who, chemistry is not my first love, but it's fascinating, and I think you need to do that. I think that's an important element. It's about learning all the time.
Yeah. And I think research certainly helps with that. So often students that go in to do a PhD, often the first 6 months to a year, a lot of it is literature review. A lot of it is actually saying what's out there, and what, and you really need to use your brain as a sponge in order to be able to say, what information is out there, what have other people done. And what you often find is that actually leads you into some other disciplines as well, which is important. And I think that there is a problem in the UK, generally speaking, about literacy in science, in that I don't think that we are a very literate scientific community. But I also think that's partly because people are scared of science, in the sense that, people are in some ways conditioned to believe that it's difficult. And again, I realize I'm perhaps swaying into education in physics, or physics and education, which I won't dive into, but the key thing, I think, is curiosity. And if you're curious and if you're interested, and also I think you have to be very humble to be a scientist. So I said this before, right? You need to, when I go into my lab, I say lab, I mean, I'm a theoretician, so my lab is my desk and a pencil and paper and a waste paper basket kind of thing. But I can go into that and I can accept that whatever calculation I do, I might not get the answer that I want to, or I might be wrong in the theory that I've got in my head. And I think that, that's a really important thing as a scientist, to accept that somebody else might know more than you do. And it's a difficult human thing to do, I think, because again, we're conditioned to always want to get the right answer, which I realize I'm again straying into education in physics. So I've stopped that there.
Okay, well, maybe so we're coming up to half an hour, and we're already straying into a couple of the next topics a lot. So let's move onto part 2, environmental physics. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did, and I hope you're able to check out the other 2 episodes in this series, as well as the other Galileo interviews. Please like, share and subscribe. Thank you for your support, and see you in the next episode.